The encounter. It was a sunny afternoon in the small town of Oakwood. The streets were lively as people went about their daily routines. Among them was Miss Clara, an elderly black woman known for her kind smile and warm heart. She had lived in Oakwood for over 50 years, always greeting her neighbors with a friendly wave. On this particular day, Miss Clara decided to go for her usual walk. She loved the feeling of the sun on her face and the fresh air filling her lungs. Clutching her shopping bag, she walked slowly down Maple Street, stopping now and then to admire the flowers blooming in the gardens. But as she approached the corner store, her peaceful day was about to take a turn. A police car pulled up nearby, and Officer Daniels stepped out. He was a tall man with a stern expression, known in the community for his aggressive behavior. He had a reputation for being overly harsh, especially towards black residents, but today he was particularly on edge. Officer Daniels noticed Miss Clara as she walked by, her gentle pace and fragile figure catching his eye. In his mind, he assumed she was up to no good, a stereotype that was unfair and unfounded. He approached her with a swagger, his uniform stiff and imposing. "Hey, you!" he shouted, startling Miss Clara. She turned around, confusion written on her face. "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be in this area." Miss Clara's heart sank. "I'm just taking a walk, officer. I live nearby," she replied, trying to stay calm. But Officer Daniels wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his voice growing louder. "You need to move along. We don't want any trouble here." Bystanders began to gather, curious about the commotion. Some pulled out their phones to record the scene. Miss Clara felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She was an innocent woman, just enjoying her day, but here she was being treated like a criminal. "Sir, I really don't mean any trouble. I'm just on my way home," Miss Clara said softly, trying to explain herself. But the officer only scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Don't give me excuses. I've had enough of you people causing problems around here," he yelled, raising his voice further. The crowd murmured, shocked by his words. "Leave her alone," shouted a young man named Marcus, who had been watching from the corner. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Officer Daniels turned his anger towards Marcus, glaring at him. "And who do you think you are? You don't want to mess with me, kid." The tension in the air was thick. The bystanders were nervous, unsure of how the situation would unfold. Miss Clara felt scared, but also determined. She had lived long enough to know that she would not back down. "I'm a citizen of this town, and I have every right to be here," she spoke up, her voice strong despite her trembling hands. Officer Daniels hesitated for a moment, surprised by her courage. But instead of backing down, he grabbed her arm tightly, causing her to wince in pain. "You need to come with me," he barked. The crowd gasped, some recording the incident, while others shouted in protest. Miss Clara felt a surge of anger rise within her. She couldn't believe this was happening to her. The elderly woman who had always been a good neighbor, who had helped others in the community, was now being treated like a criminal. As Officer Daniels tried to pull her away, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Stop! What are you doing?" It was Clara's son, David, rushing toward them with a look of panic on his face. He had been working just a few blocks away when he heard the commotion and felt a sense of dread wash over him. "Mom!" David shouted, pushing through the crowd. He was a well-known community leader and had always advocated for justice. Seeing his mother in such distress ignited a fire within him. "What's going on here?" David demanded as he reached Miss Clara's side. "This officer is out of control," Marcus chimed in, pointing at Officer Daniels. "He's harassing this woman for no reason." David quickly flashed his ID badge to the officer, his voice steady but firm. "You need to let her go. She's my mother, and she hasn't done anything wrong." Officer Daniels glanced back and forth between David and Miss Clara. The anger that had fueled him began to fade as he realized he was no longer in control of the situation. Suddenly, the crowd grew larger, and voices began to rise in unison. "Let her go. Let her go," they chanted, creating a wave of support for Miss Clara. The energy shifted, and Officer Daniels felt the weight of the community watching him. In that moment, Miss Clara's heart swelled with pride. She may have been a target of hate, but here were her neighbors, standing up for her. The support from the crowd gave her strength, and she stood tall, refusing to let fear take over. Officer Daniels finally released his grip on Miss Clara's arm, taking a step back. The crowd erupted in cheers, and a sense of relief washed over everyone. But the confrontation was not over. David looked straight at the officer, disappointment and anger etched on his face. "You need to understand that your actions have consequences. This is not how you treat people, especially in our community." The tension began to ease, and Officer Daniels knew he had crossed a line. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Clara felt a mix of emotions. She was grateful for the support, but she also felt a deep sadness about how people could treat each other. Today had started as a simple walk in the sun, but it had turned into a battle against injustice. And as Miss Clara walked home with her son by her side, she knew this was only the beginning of a larger fight for respect and equality in Oakwood. The fallout. The sun had set on Oakwood, casting long shadows on the streets where the earlier confrontation had taken place. Miss Clara sat in her living room, wrapped in a warm blanket, still trying to process what had happened. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her feeling exhausted and shaken. Her son, David, sat across from her, concern etched on his face. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice filled with worry. "I can't believe that happened today. That officer had no right to treat you like that." Miss Clara took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. "I'm all right, David, just a bit rattled. I never thought I'd be in a situation like that, especially at my age. It's so upsetting to think that someone could see me like that." David nodded, his expression serious. "This isn't just about you, Mom. It's about what's happening in our community. People need to know that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. We can't let it slide." The next day, news of the incident spread quickly through Oakwood. The video recorded by bystanders had gone viral, and people were talking about it everywhere, on social media, in the coffee shops, and even in the schools. Supporters rallied around Miss Clara, expressing their outrage at how she had been treated. At the local community center, a meeting was called to address the growing tension. David attended, eager to take part in the discussion. He arrived to find a crowd of concerned citizens gathered, their faces filled with determination. As David took his seat, the town's mayor, Mrs. Thompson, stood up to speak. "Thank you all for coming. This is a critical time for our community. We cannot stand by while any resident, especially someone as respected as Miss Clara, is treated unjustly. We need to act." The room erupted in applause, and David felt a surge of hope. This was the kind of response that was needed. Mrs. Thompson continued, "We must demand accountability from our police force. We need to work together to ensure that this never happens again." After the mayor finished speaking, the crowd shared their own stories of discrimination and unfair treatment. Each tale was more heart-wrenching than the last. David listened intently, feeling the weight of their shared experiences. A woman named Angela spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was stopped by police just last month for no reason at all. I was terrified. I thought they were going to hurt me. This is happening too often." Another man, James, added, "I've seen the way they treat my friends. It's like we're criminals just because of the color of our skin. We need to stand together." The passion in the room was palpable, and David felt inspired. He raised his hand and stood up to speak. "We can't let fear silence us anymore. We have to hold the police accountable for their actions. We need to start a dialogue with the officers, make them understand our experiences." As he spoke, David could see the fire in the eyes of the people around him. They were ready to fight for change. They wanted to reclaim their community and ensure that it was a safe place for everyone, regardless of race. After the meeting, a group of residents, including David and Angela, decided to form an advocacy group. They called themselves Voices of Oakwood. Their goal was to bring attention to the issues of racism and police brutality in their town. They planned to organize peaceful protests, raise awareness, and work with local leaders to implement changes within the police department. Miss Clara, though shaken by the previous day's events, was proud of her son. She knew how much this meant to him and to the community. "I'll support you, David," she said with determination. "We need to make sure our voices are heard." The following weekend, the group held their first rally in the park. Banners reading "Justice for All" and "End Police Brutality" flapped in the wind. People gathered from all over Oakwood, some bringing their children, while others held signs demanding change. The atmosphere was electric with hope and determination. As David took the microphone to speak, he felt a rush of adrenaline. "Thank you all for being here today. We stand together to show that we will not tolerate injustice in our community. Our voices matter, and we will fight for what is right." The crowd cheered, their spirits lifted by his words. Miss Clara stood among them, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her son inspire others. She realized that the fight for equality was not just her battle. It was a collective effort that could bring about real change. However, not everyone in Oakwood was supportive of the movement. Some locals viewed the protests as a threat to the status quo. They believed the police were doing their job and that the community was overreacting. Rumors began to spread and tension grew among residents. Miss Clara's phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor who had heard some harsh words spoken against their group. "They're saying things about you, Clara. They think you're stirring up trouble." She sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and fear. "People don't understand what it's like to be treated unfairly. They don't see the bigger picture," she replied to David, who was listening closely. "They will, Mom," he said confidently. "With enough voices, we can change their minds. It's time for them to see the truth." As the rallies continued and the community became more involved, Miss Clara realized that this was not just a fight for herself, but for the generations to come. She felt a sense of purpose, knowing that she was part of something bigger than herself. The wheels of change were beginning to turn in Oakwood, and together, they would not be silenced. The investigation. As the days passed, the movement in Oakwood gained momentum. News outlets began covering the protests, and the story of Miss Clara and the unjust arrest spread beyond the town's borders. The footage captured during the incident was played repeatedly on television, drawing attention from local and national media. People across the country began to rally behind the cause, sharing the video on social media with hashtags like #JusticeForClara and #VoicesOfOakwood. The police department, under mounting pressure, announced an internal investigation into the actions of the officer involved in Miss Clara's arrest. The chief of police, Officer Johnson, held a press conference to address the community's concerns. He stood in front of a group of reporters, flanked by officers, and spoke with a serious demeanor. "We take allegations of misconduct very seriously," Officer Johnson stated. "We will conduct a thorough investigation into the actions of Officer Mitchell during the incident. Our goal is to ensure that all members of the community are treated with respect and fairness." Though many in the community appreciated the statement, others were skeptical. David and the members of Voices of Oakwood knew that words were not enough. They needed action. They discussed how to keep the pressure on the police department during their meetings. "Just because they say they're investigating doesn't mean anything will change," David reminded the group. "We need to make sure they know we're watching them. We can't let them brush this under the rug." The group decided to organize a rally outside the police department to demand transparency in the investigation. They created flyers, reaching out to local schools, churches, and community organizations to gather support. The rally was scheduled for the following Saturday, and excitement buzzed through Oakwood as the community prepared to come together once more. As the week unfolded, David found himself spending more time with Angela. They shared their thoughts about the protests, and a friendship blossomed. Angela, a bright and passionate woman in her 20s, had experienced her own struggles with racism. They bonded over their shared experiences and the desire for a better future for their community. On the day of the rally, the air was filled with anticipation. Miss Clara joined David and the other members of Voices of Oakwood, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. She wore a shirt that read, "Equality for All." As they approached the police department, she could see the crowd gathering, holding signs and chanting slogans. "Here we go, Mom," David said, a hint of pride in his voice. "We're making history today." Once they reached the steps of the police department, David took the microphone again. "Thank you all for coming today. We are here to demand accountability from our police force. We want to see real changes that ensure everyone in our community is treated fairly." The crowd cheered loudly, their voices echoing through the streets. Miss Clara felt a surge of hope. She could see how much this meant to everyone, how they were united in their fight for justice. As the rally continued, they were met with a surprising sight. Officer Johnson and several other officers emerged from the police department, walking toward the crowd. David's heart raced. He was unsure of how the community would react. "Thank you for your passion and for expressing your concerns," Officer Johnson said, his tone measured. "I want to assure you that we are committed to a fair investigation. I also want to hear your thoughts on how we can improve our relationship with the community." There was a moment of stunned silence before voices rose from the crowd, calling for change. Miss Clara felt a mixture of fear and determination. This was a chance for the community to have their voices heard. As people spoke out, sharing their experiences and suggestions, Miss Clara found the courage to step forward. "I am Miss Clara," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I believe we can make our community a better place for everyone. But we need to hold those in power accountable. We need real change, not just words." The crowd erupted into applause. Miss Clara felt the warmth of their support, realizing how much her voice mattered in this moment. As the rally came to a close, David smiled at his mother, pride shining in his eyes. They had made their point, but the work was far from over. The internal investigation was still underway, and the community needed to stay vigilant. Later that week, however, news broke that rocked Oakwood. A whistleblower from the police department came forward, revealing that Officer Mitchell had a history of excessive force complaints against him. This news fueled the fire within the community, and David knew they had to act quickly. The members of Voices of Oakwood gathered at Miss Clara's home to discuss the implications. "This is exactly what we feared," David said, anger lacing his words. "We need to get this information out to the public." "Let's organize another rally," Angela suggested. "This time, we'll call for Officer Mitchell to be held accountable for his actions, not just for this incident, but for everything he's done." As they planned the rally, Miss Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to stand up for what was right. The community had come together, and with each passing day, they were growing stronger. On the day of the next rally, Miss Clara and David stood side by side, surrounded by supporters. As the chants rang out in unison, they knew they were on the path to making a difference. Together, they would push for justice, knowing that their voices mattered and that they could no longer be silenced. The reckoning. The atmosphere in Oakwood had shifted. The community was on edge, buzzing with anticipation and anger. The news of Officer Mitchell's history of excessive force complaints sent ripples through the town. People were ready for change, and they were no longer willing to sit quietly. David and the members of Voices of Oakwood were busy organizing the next rally. They wanted to ensure that everyone understood the importance of this event. Flyers were distributed, and social media posts went viral, drawing in people from neighboring towns who were also tired of police misconduct. The day of the rally arrived, bright and sunny, but the heat was nothing compared to the fervor of the crowd. As David stood before the gathered group, he felt a mix of excitement and responsibility. He cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today. We are not just here for Miss Clara. We are here for everyone who has faced injustice. We will not stop until we see real change." His voice rang with conviction, igniting the passion in everyone present. The crowd erupted into applause, and chants of "Justice for Clara" echoed down the street. Miss Clara felt a rush of pride and determination. She looked around at the faces, both young and old, and realized the movement had grown into something bigger than she had ever imagined. As the rally progressed, community members shared their stories of police encounters that left them feeling vulnerable and powerless. Angela spoke passionately about her own experiences, recounting how she felt targeted in her neighborhood simply because of her race. Each story added weight to their cause, deepening the resolve of those gathered. "Together, we can create a better future for our children," Angela concluded, her voice strong. "We need to hold those in power accountable. They must face consequences for their actions." Suddenly, a figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was Officer Johnson, the police chief. He held up his hands, signaling for silence. "I want to address the allegations against Officer Mitchell," he began, his tone serious. "We have completed our internal investigation, and I assure you that we take these matters very seriously. Effective immediately, Officer Mitchell is suspended pending further investigation." The crowd reacted with a mix of cheers and skepticism. David felt a surge of hope, but remained cautious. They had seen this before, promises made but rarely kept. "What about the other complaints?" someone shouted from the crowd. "What about accountability?" "Everyone deserves a fair chance," Officer Johnson replied, his expression stern. "But I can assure you that we will address this matter thoroughly." Miss Clara felt a flicker of hope as she listened to Officer Johnson. Perhaps, just maybe, change was possible. But in the days that followed, tension returned to the town. A local news station reported that Officer Mitchell had hired a high-profile lawyer, and rumors spread that he intended to fight the suspension. This news angered the community once again, reigniting their passion for justice. The voices of Oakwood quickly regrouped to plan their next steps. They decided to gather more evidence and testimonies against Officer Mitchell. David took it upon himself to collect written accounts from anyone who had faced issues with the officer in the past. While they worked diligently, Miss Clara decided to take her own initiative. She reached out to her network and organized a community meeting at the local library. She wanted to create a safe space for people to come together, share their experiences, and strategize their next moves. As the meeting commenced, Miss Clara welcomed everyone and introduced David, who laid out their objectives clearly. "We need to compile as many testimonies as possible and present them to the police department. Our voices will not be ignored any longer." One by one, residents shared their stories. Some recounted experiences of racial profiling, while others spoke about how they had been treated during routine stops. Miss Clara listened intently, her heart aching for those who had suffered. Each story fueled her determination to fight for change. By the end of the night, they had gathered an impressive list of testimonies. David suggested they create a petition to present to the police chief, demanding further accountability for Officer Mitchell. "I believe if we can show the department how serious this is for our community, they will have no choice but to act," David said, excitement in his voice. With the petition in hand, they mobilized to gather more support. The community rallied around them, and soon enough, they had collected over 1,000 signatures. The next rally was set to be the biggest yet. On the day of the rally, the crowd swelled, overflowing from the sidewalks into the streets. Miss Clara felt the energy pulsing through the air. She stood with David at the front, holding the petition high. "Today, we demand change," David shouted. "We stand united against injustice. We stand for our rights." The chants of the crowd filled the air, a powerful anthem of solidarity. Miss Clara's heart swelled with pride as she watched her community come together. She could see the determination on their faces, a collective force pushing for justice. As they marched toward the police department, Miss Clara spotted a few officers standing at the entrance. Her heart raced. This was the moment they had worked so hard for. David led the way, presenting the petition to Officer Johnson. "We are here today to demand accountability," he declared, his voice firm. "We will not rest until Officer Mitchell is held responsible for his actions." Officer Johnson took the petition, glancing over the signatures. Miss Clara could see the seriousness in his expression. This was a turning point. As the rally continued, the community remained steadfast, united in their quest for justice. They were ready to fight for what was right, and they wouldn't stop until they achieved it. Miss Clara felt a sense of hope rising within her. No matter what happened next, they had made their voices heard. Together, they were a force that could not be ignored, and they were determined to see their fight through to the end. The turning tide. The weeks following the rally felt both exhilarating and exhausting for the Oakwood community. The momentum was palpable, and with every day that passed, their resolve grew stronger. Miss Clara felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced in years. She was proud to see her community rising to confront injustice head-on. David and the voices of Oakwood were busy preparing for a follow-up meeting with Officer Johnson. They wanted to ensure that the police chief understood the community's demand for serious action regarding Officer Mitchell. As they gathered at the local community center, the air buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew the stakes were high. Miss Clara arrived early, her heart racing with both excitement and anxiety. She glanced around the room, seeing familiar faces filled with determination. David stood at the front, organizing the meeting materials. She could see the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. As the meeting began, David addressed the group. "Thank you all for coming. We've made great strides, but we cannot let up now. Our next meeting with Officer Johnson is crucial. We need to make our demands clear." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People nodded, their eyes shining with conviction. Miss Clara raised her hand. "What exactly do we want from this meeting? We need to be united in our message." David nodded, acknowledging her point. "We want a clear timeline for the investigation into Officer Mitchell's actions. We also want to ensure that the department implements policies for training officers on racial sensitivity and accountability." As they continued to strategize, a new sense of urgency hung in the air. They discussed gathering more testimonies and organizing a press conference to bring media attention to their cause. The community was ready to make their voices heard. As the meeting wrapped up, Miss Clara felt a surge of hope. "Let's show them we won't back down," she said, raising her fist. The room erupted in cheers, and a renewed spirit of unity filled their hearts. The following week, the meeting with Officer Johnson took place. The community arrived at the police station with their heads held high, clutching their testimonies and demands. David led the group into the building, feeling the weight of the moment. Officer Johnson greeted them with a serious expression. "Thank you for coming. I appreciate your commitment to this issue," he said, gesturing for them to sit. David took a deep breath. "We're here today to discuss the ongoing investigation into Officer Mitchell and the steps the department will take to address the community's concerns." Officer Johnson nodded, flipping through the documents in front of him. "I understand your concerns. We are taking this matter seriously, and I assure you that we will keep you updated." A murmur of skepticism swept through the room, but David pressed on. "We need more than just assurances. We need a timeline for when these changes will take place and a commitment to improve training for all officers." Officer Johnson looked thoughtful. "I understand your frustration. We're working to ensure that the department evolves and that officers receive better training. I'll provide you with a timeline for our action plan by the end of the week." Miss Clara felt a mix of hope and caution. They had heard promises before, but the community was determined to hold them accountable. "We need you to take concrete steps to ensure accountability," she said firmly. The meeting concluded with Officer Johnson promising to communicate more regularly with the community. As they left the station, David felt a sense of accomplishment. "We made our point," he said, glancing at the group. "Now we have to keep the pressure on." Back at the community center, they began planning their next steps. They decided to host a press conference to bring attention to their cause and ensure that their demands were heard. The media coverage would keep the pressure on the police department. Miss Clara took the lead in organizing the event. She reached out to local news outlets, sharing the story of Miss Clara and the community's fight for justice. As the press conference day approached, excitement built. The community was eager to share their message with a wider audience. On the day of the press conference, the sun shone brightly as members of the community gathered outside the police station. Reporters arrived, cameras ready to capture the event. Miss Clara stood at the forefront, her heart pounding with anticipation. David stepped up to the microphone first. "Thank you all for being here today. We are gathered to demand accountability and justice for the people of Oakwood. We will not rest until our voices are heard." Cheers erupted from the crowd, and Miss Clara felt a swell of pride. She stepped forward to address the media. "I am here as a representative of this community. We want to hold Officer Mitchell accountable for his actions, and we demand better training for our officers. Our voices matter, and we will not be silenced." As she spoke, the crowd rallied behind her, chanting for justice. The energy was electric. Cameras flashed, capturing the determination on their faces. The coverage of the press conference spread quickly across social media and local news outlets. Miss Clara felt the impact of their words resonating throughout the community. People began reaching out, sharing their stories, and supporting their cause. Days turned into weeks, and the momentum of the movement showed no signs of slowing down. The police department was under pressure, and Officer Johnson had begun implementing some initial changes to their training program. Miss Clara felt a flicker of hope each time she heard news of progress. But despite the positive changes, Officer Mitchell remained on suspension. The community was still waiting for a decision regarding his fate. The uncertainty weighed heavily on their minds, and Miss Clara knew they needed to keep pushing for justice. As the community continued to stand united, they prepared for another rally. This time, they would march not only for Miss Clara, but for every individual who had faced injustice. Miss Clara felt invigorated by the thought of their growing movement and the impact they were having. Together, they would push forward, ensuring that their voices would never be silenced. Change was coming, and they were ready to fight for it, no matter how long it took. The reckoning. The sun rose on the day of the planned rally, casting a golden light over Oakwood. Excitement buzzed in the air as members of the community gathered at the park. Miss Clara felt a surge of determination as she watched families, young people, and elders come together, united in their cause. Today was not just another rally. It was a statement of their resilience and their demand for justice. As people started to arrive, Clara took a moment to appreciate the crowd. Banners and signs decorated the park, some reading "Justice for All" and others, "We will not be silenced." David was at the front, directing the volunteers and ensuring everything was set for the speeches. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter, yet tinged with the seriousness of their mission. At 10 a.m., the rally officially began. Clara stepped up to the stage, heart pounding with anticipation. She looked out at the sea of faces before her and felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you all for being here today. Your presence means the world to our community," she exclaimed, her voice strong and clear. Cheers erupted from the crowd, encouraging her to continue. Today, we stand not just for Miss Clara, but for every individual who has faced injustice, for every voice that has been silenced, and for every life that has been impacted by racism. We will not rest until we see real change. The crowd roared in approval, and Clara felt her confidence soar. She introduced David, who took the stage next. "We've come together to demand accountability from our police department. We want Officer Mitchell held responsible for his actions. We want better training for all officers." His passionate words resonated with the audience. After David, several community members stepped up to share their own stories. One by one, they recounted their experiences with discrimination and abuse, each tale more heart-wrenching than the last. The air grew heavy with emotion as people shared their pain and struggles. Then, it was time for the moment everyone had been waiting for. Clara had invited Officer Johnson to speak. She knew it was crucial to hear from him directly, especially since the community had worked hard to engage with him. Clara felt a mixture of hope and apprehension as she saw Officer Johnson approach the stage. "Thank you for having me today," he began, looking genuinely moved by the crowd's energy. "I want to acknowledge the pain and anger many of you have felt. I understand that trust must be earned, and I am here to listen and to learn." The audience listened intently, some skeptical, others hopeful. "We are committed to implementing changes in our police department, including enhanced training on racial bias and accountability," he continued. "We are also conducting a thorough investigation into Officer Mitchell's actions. You deserve justice." A hush fell over the crowd. Clara could see mixed emotions on people's faces. They wanted to believe him, but after so many empty promises, skepticism lingered. One woman shouted from the back, "We want results, not just words." Officer Johnson nodded, acknowledging her concerns. "I understand, and I promise we will keep you informed every step of the way. This is not just about policing. It's about rebuilding trust between the community and the officers who serve you." Clara felt a flicker of hope. This was a step in the right direction. As Officer Johnson spoke, the crowd began to warm up to him. Perhaps, just perhaps, he meant what he said. After the speeches, the crowd marched through the streets of Oakwood, chanting slogans and holding their signs high. Clara felt a deep sense of pride as they walked side by side, each person committed to the fight for justice. It was a sight to behold, a powerful reminder of what they could achieve together. As the rally concluded, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something significant. The news coverage of the event was extensive, and people across the region began to take notice of their fight. Social media buzzed with support, and new allies started reaching out. The following days were a whirlwind. The police department received a flood of calls from citizens demanding accountability for Officer Mitchell. It was clear that the rally had sparked something larger than Oakwood. The community was no longer alone. They were part of a movement for change that extended far beyond their town. As Clara sat in her living room, reviewing news articles and social media posts, she felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. She realized that they had lit a fire, and it was up to them to keep it burning. But the fight wasn't over. Clara knew they had to keep the pressure on. They planned a series of follow-up meetings with Officer Johnson to ensure he kept his promises. The community wanted to see real, actionable steps. One evening, as Clara and David sat together strategizing, Clara looked at him, her eyes determined. "We can't let this momentum die. We have to keep advocating for change, not just for us, but for future generations." David nodded, his resolve matching hers. "Absolutely. We need to stay vigilant and keep pushing for accountability. Our community deserves better." As they continued to discuss their plans, Clara felt a renewed sense of hope. Change was within reach, and they were ready to fight for it. Together, they would work tirelessly to ensure that justice prevailed in Oakwood and beyond. The next chapter of their journey was just beginning, and they were determined to see it through. The aftermath. The days following the rally were filled with anticipation and anxiety. Clara and David worked diligently with Officer Johnson, attending community meetings and encouraging open dialogue between residents and the police. The energy in Oakwood was different. People felt empowered, and they were ready to take action. As Clara walked through the neighborhood, she noticed more conversations happening among neighbors. People were sharing their experiences and discussing how they could work together to foster understanding and change. There was a sense of unity that Clara had never felt before. It was as if the rally had opened a floodgate of voices, and now everyone wanted to be heard. One afternoon, as Clara and David sat down to review the feedback from the community meetings, Clara received a text from a local news station. They wanted to interview her about the rally and the ongoing changes in Oakwood. Clara felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was a chance to share their story with a wider audience and to shed light on the community's fight for justice. The following day, Clara arrived at the news station for the interview. She wore a simple, elegant outfit and took a deep breath to calm her nerves. As she sat down in front of the camera, the host smiled warmly at her. "Thank you for joining us, Clara. Your rally has received a lot of attention. Can you tell us what inspired you to take action?" Clara spoke passionately about the events that led to the rally. She shared her personal experiences with discrimination and the importance of community solidarity. "We have to come together and demand change," she said, her voice steady. "It's about holding ourselves and our leaders accountable." The interview aired that evening, and Clara's words resonated with viewers across the region. Many reached out to her, expressing their support and sharing their own stories. It was clear that Clara had tapped into something much bigger than Oakwood. People everywhere were seeking change and justice. In the following weeks, Clara and David continued their advocacy work. They organized workshops focusing on racial bias training and community policing, inviting local leaders and experts to participate. The police department committed to providing resources and training, and community members expressed their desire to be involved in shaping policies. However, not everyone was on board. Clara soon faced backlash from some individuals who opposed the changes. Threatening messages began to flood her social media accounts, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that standing up for justice could come with risks, but she refused to be intimidated. One night, as she was reviewing the day's events, she received a knock at the door. Clara opened it cautiously, only to find a group of her neighbors standing there, holding a large banner that read, "We stand with Clara." They expressed their gratitude for her bravery and assured her that they would support her no matter what. Moved to tears, Clara embraced her neighbors. Their solidarity reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. She wasn't alone. The community had her back, and together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. As months passed, the relationship between the community and the police department began to shift. Clara attended a town hall meeting where Officer Johnson presented the changes they had implemented. The audience listened intently as he detailed the new policies and training programs designed to promote accountability and transparency. During the Q&A session, a resident stood up, speaking passionately. "We appreciate these changes, Officer Johnson, but how can we be sure they will last? We want to see real, lasting change." Officer Johnson nodded, understanding the skepticism. "I hear you. Change takes time, but I am committed to this community. We will continue to communicate and involve you in the process. Your voices matter." The crowd erupted in applause, but Clara knew the road ahead would still be challenging. She had learned that change required constant vigilance. Clara and David decided to form a community committee focused on ongoing dialogue and engagement with the police department. They invited diverse voices from all backgrounds to ensure every perspective was heard. As the committee worked to build bridges, Clara found herself increasingly in the spotlight. News outlets continued to cover Oakwood's story, showcasing their progress and the growing partnership between the community and law enforcement. Clara became a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring others to take action in their own communities. One evening, Clara received an unexpected call. It was an invitation to speak at a national conference on community policing and social justice. She couldn't believe it. This was an opportunity to share Oakwood's story on a larger stage, to advocate for change beyond their town. After discussing it with David, Clara accepted the invitation. The day of the conference arrived, and Clara stood in front of a large audience of activists, police officers, and community leaders from across the country. As she shared her story and the lessons learned in Oakwood, she felt empowered. The audience listened intently, nodding and responding to her words. "We are stronger together," Clara concluded. "Let us remember that every voice matters. We can create change if we stand united against injustice." After her speech, attendees approached her, eager to learn more about the changes in Oakwood and how they could implement similar efforts in their own communities. Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a local movement. It was part of a national conversation about justice and equity. As she returned home, Clara reflected on how far they had come. The fight for justice was ongoing, but she knew that the seeds of change had been planted. Oakwood was a model for what could be achieved when people came together, and Clara was committed to nurturing that growth. With David by her side and the support of her community, Clara felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would continue to push for change, ensuring that the voices of those who had been silenced would finally be heard. The journey was far from over, but the future looked brighter than ever.